Hello and welcome to our sixth and final developer live stream for this summer Steam Game Festival. We'll be playing Breakpoint, our retro-inspired tribute to classic twin-stick arcade games. My name is Nick, half of the studio making the game. With me is Ed, the other half of the studio. And joining us is Steve Zapata, tech artist at Niantic. Steve, how are you doing this evening?
I'm good. Really good. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Is it Niantic or Niantic? I'm not entirely sure ever.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's a right answer. I would always say Niantic.
Niantic,
because I like the mouthfeel better. But
yeah, me too.
Yeah, it matters.
It's like Niantic is like the cat version of this. That's why I always feel like it's too. I like the more distributed
that's actually
Niantic.
I'm surprised we haven't done something with that. Yeah, we should absolutely do a little logo with the cat. Yeah, that'd be really good.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Perfect. From a general question, actually, what is a tech artist?
Okay. All right. That's what we're doing here. Cool. So tech art is a really broad category. Or it's a really broad field, and there's not really a right answer.
Okay.
Best I can say is tech art is kind of the sort of connective tissue between the software engineers and the artists on the team, right?
Okay, gotcha.
So I'll do anything from sort of trying to translate visual ideas like concept art into working game aesthetics for video games, right?
Right.
Anything from that to putting together tools to help artists build things faster or just implement ideas more quickly, just anything like that. But it's a really broad field, and there's sort of a lot of different things within it.
How much would you say you spend time doing actual art yourself in terms of within the company, as in creating the art, reinterpreting what a concept artist has done versus creating a tool for an artist?
Let's see. So I spend nearly no time, almost zero time drawing, if that's sort of what you're asking. And at this point, I've sort of stopped doing modeling for the most part. I think specifically for me, my interests lie within something called shaders, which is sort of the technology for how things are drawn on screen, right? So when you think about a drawing 2D, you've got outlines, right? And then you've got the shading part, which is gives it volume and lighting and depth, and a lot of different artists have different styles, right? And so those styles are sort of their different ways of shading. So that's what a shader is, only for computers instead of paper, right?
Right.
And they're little algorithms basically, and so that's a big focus of mine. So art, but with math and numbers instead.
Gotcha. I've seen your style before, and I'd be able to somewhat describe it to other people. How would you describe your style to others?
I don't know that I have a style, to be honest.
Oh, really? Okay. Because I saw when I look at some of the stuff that you're doing personally, and then some of the stuff that obviously, the way the inner space looks, I kind of describe it as light, pastel-y, surreal, and it has it has nice, almost light desaturated colors, but it's very warm and welcoming despite it. So it definitely does have an evocative look, but I guess I was just sort of curious if you had a way of describing it yourself to other people, other than just showing to other folks whenever you're sort of at a gathering and you describe to other people, I'm a tech artist, and then other people probably ask, what does that mean? And what does your art look like? So
I see. Well, first off, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, I don't know if what I said was actually flattering. I just sort of thought it was a nice way of describing it that I thought was fairly succinct anyways.
I thought it was flattering. So thanks. I guess for me, at least personally, right, there's sort of a difference between personal style and then being able to sort of intentionally create a style or a feel within graphics, right? And I think when I look at the stuff that I make personally, it tends to be a lot more saturated and a lot I don't know, edgier, I guess. I don't know.
Okay.
But when I think about making like style for games and stuff, right? Like almost always it's in service of trying to hit a specific feel or a specific tone, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
So
something that was predetermined for the game itself.
Yeah. So for Inner Space, the game you mentioned, which is a game that I worked on a couple years ago, released in 2018 now, the intent there was, sort of really sort of appealing, attractive, bright pastel-y colors and things like that, right? And so the effort was to, almost not watercolor in terms of like the feel, but in terms of
sort of way of
color palette, I guess. Was to sort of hit that and to sort of hit the same moods and feelings that sort of work would convey.
Was there a reason for that in particular, like specifically watercolor, or was it just something that was just born out of this looks good, I think we should explore this?
Yeah, so I guess for that game, one of the sort of core artistic goals that I had, because the game is about basically so it's been a while, geez. So basically, you're an airplane that can also transform into a submarine, and you sort of fly around these planets that are dead. Gotcha. And so the sort of artistic goal that I had, just personally, was this sort of fascination with this juxtaposition between like dead and decaying things, and then like beauty that comes out of that. And so personally, I wanted to sort of portray the sort of beautiful bones of these dead planets.
Gotcha.
And to make exploring that, feel like and evoke something, that was like pleasant, that you wanted to just chill and spend some time in, right?
Gotcha.
And then to let the player kind of discover the depth over time.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was the intent there.
Okay, that makes sense. Because we've kind of touched upon it a little bit without actually going too deep into it, would you mind walking me through a little bit of your game design history, or just game development history?
Yeah, sure. So I was an indie dev that started game design and development in Texas.
Gotcha.
Let's see, graduated from UT Dallas for games and visuals and stuff in 2015.
Okay.
And then basically spent the next 5 years doing game jams and working my ass off trying to make.
Oh damn!
I know this is a PG-rated stream.
Yeah.
But trying to make this indie game that we had kickstarted. So did that. Did the whole take it to showcases, find a publisher, get it on platforms and stuff.
Yeah.
And kind of during that time, I was burning myself out doing like basically just tons and tons of game jams and just trying different ideas visually, gameplay wise, etc. And then following that, I joined Niantic, where I've been slowly moving from just visuals and graphics into proper sort of game scripting and prototyping.
Gotcha. Do you enjoy the move in terms of like, because I imagine at Polynite, when you guys were making Inner Space, you've probably got to explore more creative freedom yourself. Do you like doing what you're doing at Niantic with the more focused scope?
I do. I mean, it's different, right? And I think like it's sort of in service of like, I guess one of the things that I'm really appreciative of is that I have basically time to an opportunity there to learn the scripting side of things, right? And I have the support of actually working at that company that enables me to do
right.
that.
Yeah.
So that's sort of been a little bit of a sacrifice at the same time, right? Because it's meant that I've basically, I've got this like developed skill set with like graphics and things, right? And then I'm like doing like some baby shit basically on scripting stuff, and I'm just like an absolute child, and slowly building up that skill set.
Okay, yeah.
But I think I've been doing that for about a year and a half, and so I'm sort of at the point now where I'm starting to do more prototypes and starting to feel a bit more comfortable with that skill set, which is in turn allowing me to flex some of my other skills.
Gotcha.
And so it's starting to feel, significantly more comfortable.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So for someone who's regularly and actively a part of already for their job, a part of the game industry, how important it is for you to do personal work on the side to exercise your own personal creativity?
Extremely.
So pretty, okay. Because some people are just pretty, I know that some people are pretty satisfied. They just sort of leave their creativity at work. Because they're just sort of done with the workday and they just do other things. They take a hike, or like literally, I don't mean, they get
literally go on a hike.
I mean, do it, stay healthy, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. They do other things, but they don't. A few of them don't actually do like that kind of art stuff on their own, because they're sort of just they're done with that stuff at the end of the workday. But it sounds like you still have sort of ideas and creative outlets that you still want to explore whenever you're doing your personal projects. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think for me, again, a lot of it is sort of in this pursuit of like trying to learn and grow my skill set, and the way that I tend to do that is to, you know, follow my curiosity, right?
Yeah.
So oftentimes what'll happen is there will be a thing that I see an opportunity for at work, but I don't necessarily have the the time to sort of explore, because like we just can't justify it.
Right. Yeah.
Like, here's this idea that I have that I can't prove works, but it would be really neat if it did, huh?
Yeah.
Like, that's a hard thing to justify, right?
You're right. Like telling your superior or whatever, like, give me just some time to figure this one out.
Yeah, especially like, with like the COVID stuff going on and
You're
sort of
right.
reconfigure a lot of the way the game works. I work on Pokemon Go there, so we've had to reconfigure quite a number of gameplay elements.
Right.
Yeah,
Or
because
you
you're not
can,
exactly
but you're not encouraged to right now.
right. We don't want people like to group up and sort of play in like close areas, which is sort of previously like the point, right?
The way up, yeah. Playing
Some
Pokemon Go.
changes
Had to be made. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess basically my answer on that one is, yeah, a lot of times when I'll see an opportunity, it'll just sort of become like an interest that I have personally, and so I will want to explore that or feel that out, right? Again, just for my own curiosity,
Right.
and whether or not it's something that I've seen at work, right? Like that's just sort of how my brain works. Like I'll like have a
Just in
thought or
general.
see a thing, want to explore it, and then neat, I made something with this idea that I've pursued. What can I
Gotcha.
apply it to? And then that sort of that takes over, and I sort of pick an application for that idea at that point.
Okay. Gotcha. What would you say was the last thing you did that for?
The last thing I did that for, I can't tell you about.
Okay.
NDAs.
What is the? I guess more. No, that's perfectly fine. I totally understand. What is the last thing you did that for that was publicly visible to people? If you can recall, it might be too long.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so I guess in Pokemon Go right now there are we implemented some shadows on the character and like your like main buddy Pokemon, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And that was so whenever the buddy thing was being prototyped, that was being prototyped by another tech artist on the team, who I'm going to be working with in the future actually on some prototyping.
Cool.
So she's really awesome, and she had this sort of idea and this sort of rough prototype for the shadows, right?
Okay.
But I think pretty much any developer also knows that like shadows are like generally an expensive thing in games.
Right.
So on mobile, where battery life is a premium, it's a real big ask to sort of like just throw on some shadows, right?
Right. Exactly.
And so this was sort of a thing that was like, oh, we'd love to do this because visually it would add a ton, right? But like, how do we do this without adding that huge amount of expense that comes with shadows?
Right.
So there was a the way that we ended up implementing the shadows is through a shader-based method instead of using like a traditional shadow casting method.
Right. Okay.
And this might get a little technical, right? But like in games, typically you'll have like the camera that draws like the thing that you're seeing on screen, and then you'll basically, in order to cast shadows, have a whole other camera that sits somewhere else in the scene that then draws basically the whole scene again, and then compares the two to create the shadows, and then puts the shadows on top of the first camera.
Right.
So that's like a ton of extra rendering, and like just not something that's like feasible on mobile.
Right.
So basically, we found a way to do it without having to use that extra camera and all of that extra rendering tech. And the shadows are less scalable, broadly speaking, but for the specific use case that we had, they work fine. And actually, the resolution on them is like
still quite good.
Quite better. Like just like night and day difference.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. So like I'm really proud of the solution that we came to on that one. But that was sort of a thing that was a lot of sort of personal explorations and previous experience just sort of went into that.
Gotcha.
But I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't know why I'm being interviewed, I guess, because we're going to talk about your game, right? Because your game's coming out soon.
Yes, it is. It's just sort of like a fun thing of mine to sort of poke it. I also did not mean to have that question explicitly within the context of Pokemon Go. It didn't have to be. It could have been just like a personal project if you wanted to explain that. It makes sense for people to be able to have the context of something that is broadly exposed as Pokemon Go to be able to understand the answer that you were going to give, but it totally could have just been like, the singer who you did the sort of like tribute cover art for,
yes.
you could have said that, and
Yeah,
that would, I think that could have been fine. But you answered a Pokemon Go question, so it's perfectly fine. I think people would understand that. Yeah, feel free to ask questions back and forth. The only reason why I'm doing this is because, for me personally, it's fun to kind of talk amongst developers and kind of give a little bit of behind the curtain look for folks who don't always get a chance to ask questions to or talk with folks who are involved in game development, to kind of just give people oversight to things that happen in game development. We're kind of just giving an atmosphere here where we're just having fun. Hanging out, playing Breakpoint in the background. It's kind of one of the ways that we felt that Breakpoint could be played. Obviously, when you're playing it by yourself and you're trying to get high on the scoreboard, that's sort of a dedicated thing you can do, and we encourage people to do. Obviously, we've been playing up the leaderboard. But that being said, it's also definitely an atmosphere where, if you are just hanging out with your friends on Discord and you have Breakpoint in the background, it's totally something you can do. It's totally something we're doing right now. We want to explain to people, like, this is totally a way you can play Breakpoint. It's not a hyper focused kind of thing always. It's definitely something you can just kind of chill out with.
I guess well, so can I ask you sort of, I guess, diving into like what we're actually seeing on screen here, because I think like right now Ed is playing, right?
Yep, that's me.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, I gotcha. So I know that when I played the game, and I actually got done just doing probably 30 minutes on it, just to sort of refresh myself on the thing.
Yeah.
But there are sort of like a couple things that, like, there are a couple like corollary games that it sort of reminds me of, certain elements in it, right? Both in the combat system as well as in sort of the way y'all have designed like the game feel. And so I'm sort of kind of curious, right? Like, just sort of broadly, like what influences are y'all pulling from for this game? And it kind of in what areas?
Certainly a lot of them, but that's a big question.
I'm sure
so
there are a ton,
yeah.
Are there maybe like a couple like key influences in particular?
I think so.
Also, sorry, just to cut in really quickly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess it's also interesting for me because I'm curious if the things that I've imagined the influences being are actually going to be it, or if I'm just totally way off.
That's actually why I didn't ask, like, oh, what did you think? Because I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure he's asking because he's kind of curious whether or not he hit the mark on what our inspirations were. So when we were designing, I think my primary obvious visual inspiration was Geometry Wars, and I think that actually, to kind of go into the reason why that was the case, when we were developing the game during the game jam's theme was intentionally broken, and we just sort of wanted a system where we'd already decided that breaking your weapon was going to be the primary function of the game. And so I asked, well, how do we make this into a fun mechanic? And so we needed, I was very heavy on saying, we need to make sure that the actual breaking of the weapon feels good. Like, it's not even just like an ancillary thing that just happens to also have a good thing. No, it needs to be the point of the gameplay. It needs to be the focus of the gameplay. So it can't just, sit on the side or just like, oh, it's great that it did, but I'm just mostly focused on hitting guys. So
and also, like, y'all managed to, like, I know you're saying that was the point, but like really y'all hit it. Like, it feels so good to break your weapon in the game. Just the whole game feels really good.
That's also we were very, Ed and I and many of the people that were involved during the jam tend to be very like modest seeking when we're like, oh, we'll just have like this subtle nuance kind of thing, and we generally kind of only lightly touch upon the kind of things that we kind of want to put in. We don't want to overload the player, but in this case we were very deliberately we're like, whatever, we're definitely just going to be like, everything over the top. Hits are over the top, screen shake kind of over the top, like the neon lights, they're over the top, like everything. We're just going to be non-subtle about it. We're going to try non-subtlety this time. We're going to be very in your face about a lot of stuff, and then we can scale back if things are actually too much. When we were developing the perspective, because early on when you're doing game development, obviously, and you're aware of this already, you kind of have to ask yourself, what is the breadth of capability that we have available to us? If you're already a game developer or a group of game developers that are already used to 3D game design and doing like first-person shooters, maybe during a game jam, you won't have much leeway to explore other things. So you'll probably just go with that. You'll probably just do something you're really familiar with. For us, being familiar with something where we sort of cut out one of the dimensions in terms of 3D, like we've done 3D before, but we didn't want like navigational space in 3D didn't seem to fit within the purpose of this design, because exploration or perspective didn't seem to matter within the design of the game. So we were like, well, it doesn't matter whether or not it's 2D or 3D. It seems like, or I'm sorry, it doesn't matter if it's 3D and we have another dimension to explore. It seems more like we can get away with doing 2D, do less with our workload, and then at that point it's just a matter of deciding whether or not it's side-scrolling or top-down. So at that point we were like, okay, well, probably top-down, because we kind of want to be able to explore movement freely, because we just didn't see this as being a platform-heavy game. We just hadn't talked about it that way. Yeah. And at that point, we were trying to explore, what does this game look like? And in the beginning, a lot of the conversation was, because you have weapons, obviously you have a character, right? And if you have a character, it's probably going to look like Hotline Miami. And I was like, oof, I don't know if I want to make this like Hotline Miami. I am not super big fan of that, like the square shoulders kind of character look, unless it's Hotline Miami, which does it very well. But I was like, I don't know if I want that, because I actually don't want to pull from the things that Hotline Miami is doing, which is like that was more like that game is a gun game, and it was very like high precise kind of like replay when you're dead kind of thing. And so I was like, I don't know if we want to do that. Here's another idea for something, because I was developing the background. Why don't we just like be super abstract with our characters, just not even really care about the characters themselves? Since we haven't talked about this being a character-oriented game anyways, let's just make this super abstract as possible. One of the first obvious abstract things to pull from was just shapes, and so when you develop shapes and neon glowing background, you inevitably pull up geometry wars. So that became the first point of inspiration for that design. It just so happens I just like visual style of this kind of game.
I'm just
looks like
watching the gameplay
Tron.
here. I love the axe so much.
Yeah, it was awesome and interesting to be able to redesign a lot of the weapons when we were after the jam. It was cool to be able to explore weapon designs. In
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No. Please do so at every opportunity, whenever it's applicable. I don't mind at all. In terms of gameplay feel, I think at least one thing was sort of one of the ideas was running in parallel to our ideas, which was Zelda Breath of the Wild. When your weapon gets destroyed in that game, it does the same thing. It pushes the enemy away for the same functional reason. You need to be safe when your weapon is destroyed. Because you need to give the player time to switch to another weapon. So it's sort of like a very obvious thing to indicate to the player, like, hey, just to let you know, your weapon broke, so this can't be a subtle thing. Like, it needs to be obvious and clear to you that it happened. But also, let's just push them away, the enemies away, so that you're a little safe while you decide what to do next. Like, you can decide to run, you can decide to
score. That score hurts me so much. I'm sitting at like 16,000 and just like I can't get over like that bump.
Yeah. It's definitely a try again harder next time kind of game.
Oh, but I love it though. The Breath of the Wild bit is really interesting. When you're talking about sort of like the non-subtle, like pushing enemies away, right?
Right.
Because I think like it does add like that like visual flair for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But like the functionality of the thing actually does seem pretty subtle to me. And you were sort of talking with talking about your history with making like, you know, subtle games and all that sort of stuff. That with this one, you just went like full, pedal to the metal, right?
Pretty
but
much.
I think what actually works, at least for me, what sort of shines through on this one is that it does have a lot of subtlety. Not in presentation, like obviously, right? And like that's the point, you know. But in like, I guess like mechanical depth. Is how I would say that, right? So like one of the things that stuck out to me when I was playing this one is that it reminded me like the game systems, not the literal gameplay, right? But the sort of like way you discover mechanics and sort of the way that you can like observe like through the replay system and stuff that y'all have, which is freaking awesome, by the way, is
Ed,
how you can
thank
sort of
you.
like observe like this like really like deep combat system, and sort of like get it like really easily, like really quickly. You can understand like exactly like, oh, that's a thing that I could do. I see how they're using this scalar. I see how they're sort of, you know, navigating around the enemies, trying to, you know, achieve this or that, right? But then to replicate that requires a lot of skill, right? And the sort of game that actually reminds me of is Rocket League.
Oh, really?
That's an interesting.
Yeah, I think it's actually really similar, right? So like, I used to play a ton of Rocket League, and one of the things that really stands out to me is that, yeah, you sort of get it pretty easily, right? Like, okay, your car, you got a rocket on the back and get the ball into the goal, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And there aren't like many like hidden systems there. Like you can boost, you can jump, and so like there are all these like things you can do, right? But they're all sort of built on these like foundational things, right?
Right.
And so discovery of the mechanics is done pretty early, and then it becomes about execution, just execution.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And
so
and that
mastery
happens-
of it is more just like something that you explore yourself and can explore yourself, as opposed to just learning by looking up like a cheat sheet of moves you can do, like a fighting game, for example, where you're like, oh, I have to learn that Dragon Punch is the motion to do this move. It's nothing like that. It's a lot more like, oh, all of the skills you have are extensions of something you already understand. You just know how to master. You need to know how to master.
Yeah, it's sort of how do you combine these existing systems in interesting ways, but it's not hidden from the player.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what's super cool about it to me, is that there is a ton of like gameplay depth within the combat system, and you know, partly because like there are different weapons and stuff, right? But I think like the weapons provide a little bit of like different like sort of game feel, but like they don't actually fundamentally change the systems that much, right?
No, they don't. Yeah, that's something that we. So first of all, I generally, in fact, I 90% of the way agree with you about hiding stuff, though we do have technically some hidden mechanics that are not told to the player explicitly, but that's actually one of the reasons why we're heavy about the discovery of the systems through other mechanics. We in all aspects of the game, there is a way to find out about everything within the game itself. Like, one of the first things I will say is, if you're confused about anything, just go to the options menu with the controls. Like, it'll tell you everything that's in the game right there. Like,
I turned on the I taught on the little arrow like indicator thing. Like character thing. Yeah, just because it helped me a ton.
Yeah, exactly. Because I try to make the ship, like the shape of the ship, you can tell like what area, or I'm sorry, what direction you're pointing in. But that being said, I still think it's like important for a lot of players, when lost in the fray of everything, to be able to see something that sticks out from your character, so you can tell. Like, if you are not used to or would just prefer being able to see that thing, we'd give that option to players, because it's important to be able to think about that for other players.
Or if you're just like bad at twin sticks in general, like I am, right? Anything helps.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to make sure. So, touching upon what you're talking about there, about whether or not there's hidden mechanics or something that is apparent to the player versus something that you need to learn, we wanted to make sure that people who are not necessarily good at twin stick shooters could still play this game and enjoy at least some of the fundamental aspects of it, most namely, obviously, the visual aspects of it, but then also they'd be able to do it for at least a little bit of time. Like, we wanted to make sure that this was an easy to learn, hard to master kind of experience. I'm personally kind of a big fan of those kinds of systems, because I mean, like, I think some people will disparage me for this, and that's perfectly fine, because I have an opinion about that matter regardless, but it's some people think about, like, I'm a fan of Smash, for example, the competitive scene in Smash, and it's for the reason that I personally think that Smash is easy to learn, hard to master kind of game. There's a lot going on there that you can learn how to enjoy, and learn how to just have fun with, but also and just learn how to style and do whatever. But then, if you actually want to get deep into a lot of the systems, the game often does give you, and it'll depend on which version of Smash you're talking about, but most of the time you have the ability to express yourself not only through like styling in the game and how cool it is to play the character, your favorite character, but also through some inherent mechanics that the game doesn't hide from you, but that you can explore deeply. Like, that's that's just one of the things that I just, in general, as a designer, value very deeply. Is I think that's it's hard, in my opinion, to be able to create games that aren't explicitly designed just for a smaller audience, because I think it's a little easier once you identify like this is the audience we want and this is how we want to cater to them.
Yeah.
It's harder to do something where you say this is the broad range of audiences we want. How do we cater to all of them without sacrificing a lot?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's where, for me, when I'm thinking about the design of the game, I'm thinking, how do we make sure that we maintain a lot of the depth that I personally appreciate and that I personally think people will appreciate once they get to it? How do we make sure that people can acclimate to the game to get to that point? Because I want to make sure that people are. I think it's one thing to make a hard game. It's another thing to teach a player how to play a hard game. And I think
that's a really good point.
It's
put that on the back of the box, dude.
And I personally think it's a great challenge for a lot of designers to think about, like, dude, it's fine. Like, everybody, when they're starting out making games and starting in game design, it's like, yeah, of course, a lot of your games are going to be hard because you know how to play your game. Not everybody else knows how to play your game. You know all the intricacies of your design, and you can very easily create highly specific, tuned solutions that apply to what you like in games. The challenge here is that, like, do other people understand? Should they understand? Because I think,
and then also sort of building in the mechanisms to allow them if they don't, right?
Exactly.
And again, like going back to the replay system, which I think we're actually watching right now. Like,
yeah,
watching.
I'm just playing some
very good players,
right? Top of the leaderboard, yeah.
But like some of the things that I'm picking up on just in the replay system, right, are things like the throw mechanic, which like I saw the replayer use it. Like, they were sort of cornered, and there were just like a ton of enemies coming up on them. And like they did a swipe and then threw the thing, and it broke. And it looked like it sort of cleared like a path almost, right?
Right.
And yeah, that's rad, and something that I don't think I would have like picked up on if I hadn't have watched some gameplays previously where I saw players do that.
Right.
I'll sort of pick up on this one. If you've ever played Devil Daggers, this is definitely where the original inspiration for the replay system came from. And the reason I actually, one of the reasons I should say, that throw, exactly.
Oh, God, yeah.
So I'll get back to the throw in a minute here, and I'll explain sort of how that's working. But the reason one of the reasons I put it in the replay system was there was a moment of discovery for me in Devil Daggers where there was a mechanic I just wasn't understanding. There are these gems that drop from certain enemies, and you want to pick them up because they upgrade your weapon in Devil Daggers. But they just they're really hard to pick up. If you're trying to run over them, you just can't grab them. Their hitboxes are so tiny.
Very tiny. Yeah.
But watching a replay, I was like, oh, this guy stops firing sometimes. Like, why does he stop firing sometimes? And it's because the gems actually attract to you if you stop firing. So I was like, oh, now I get it.
It's like there is a mechanic here that I've been missing.
Yeah. Exactly. So the replay system, one of the hopes is that it'll function in a similar way, where it's like, oh, why is he doing that thing? Or how is he doing that thing? Maybe I can try to replicate that. And it turns a moment of loss, where you're at the leaderboard with just staring at the scores, like, how the hell do I get this? Into a moment of inspiration where it's okay, yeah, that's how I do it.
Right. This is especially important with the throwing too, because I think with the throwing, a lot of people will dismiss it immediately because they're just like, they hit a few guys, it doesn't explode, and they're like, what, that was dumb, okay, whatever. And then they will just dismiss it after a while. But if you see people use it correctly, or how to use it, because you don't need to use it all the time, and not everybody does, but when you see people do use it correctly, you're like, oh, I guess there's more application to this than I thought. It definitely turns, like in Smash, for example, when you'll always instantly think the characters you're bad at, or the characters that other people are bad at, are just bad. And then you see MK Leo style on everybody and beat everybody in the next tournament, and you're like, oh my god, this character is OP. this is the best character ever, and you're like, well, can you do it? How come you didn't say so when you first? It's because you haven't seen examples of it. He's showing you an example.
It's the difference between like what you can do and then like how you can do it. Almost,
exactly.
You know.
Right.
And
so
like another thing that sort of sticks out to me, sort of in that same vein, right, is the sort of analog twist mechanic they all have. Right?
Yeah.
So this is one of my favorites, and it sort of reminds me of some other sort of third-person hack and slash games that I've played.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And just as a side comment, right, one of the things that I really love about this game is that it doesn't feel like a twin-stick shooter at all. Like it feels like a freaking high, like super fast-paced, like a Zelda game almost.
Yes.
You know, like super
Thank you for
fast.
saying so.
Which is such a cool, again, like just a cool game feel, right? But yeah, the sort of analog twist. So just to describe what I'm talking about, so with the axe or like the hammer especially, right? Like you hit the button and it like swings it, right? You hit the heavy attack button and it does like a bigger swing, right?
Right.
But if you actually notice the way the weapon swings, like right to left or left to right, you know? If you also push your analog stick in that direction and then twist it in the direction of the swing as it's swinging, right? Like you can get quite a bit more coverage with your weapon,
right?
You know?
Yeah.
And so where your weapon might normally have like a 120 degree arc, you can make that like a 270 degree arc,
right?
You know?
Pretty large. And this is actually tweaked per weapon and per attack. So we actually have like lerping between just certain numbers that allow you to either restrict or unrestrict your movement. Like for example, one of the more broad facing weapons that allows you to do this is the daggers and the lance, ironically, because these are very disparate weapons in terms of function. But
and the lance, just to be clear, is not in the demo version, but it is in the full version.
Right.
I mean, and that was they all have extra weapons in the version.
Right. Yeah, the ones I'm talking about anyway. And that was very deliberate because we wanted a certain feel for how we wanted these weapons to behave in the hands of the player. Certain weapons, like for example the hammer, that has I think the least movement allowed for when you swing, and that's because we wanted the hammer to feel heavy. We wanted to make sure that when you swing it, its arc is low and that you're just basically committed to the swing. Not only is it slow, but it doesn't allow you to change your swing that much. You're basically committed to the angle that you started at and mostly to the angle you ended at, with a little bit of leeway but not much. And so it's with that in mind that we were like, how do we build in game feel to the way that the weapons function and that what kind of options are available to the player, and how do we make sure that it doesn't get in the way of the functionality of that weapon. So you're right in saying that it feels like a sort of like a fast-paced Zelda, because for example the sword in our game, which is also not in the demo, but the sword in the game, its very first swipe was basically Link's Awakening or A Link to the Past first swing. It's just a swing with the sword. When you first swing with the sword, it just swings left to right. He just swings out and points it outwards, and that's actually one of the reasons why the sword actually doesn't end in a full arc in front of you. It ends forward, because I was like, no, I want to make the Zelda swing. I want to make that specific. There's a reason why that works in that game, and if I don't understand it, then like it kind of. Like I need to make a way to make this work, because I want to draw exact parallels to Zelda. I think it can work, and so for the most part, it goes a little bit to the right, but it stays in front of you for the same reason.
That's funny, actually, because I remember when I was sort of playing, because I favorite the axe pretty heavily right now, but that's probably because I haven't put in enough time to really favor some other weapons.
Sure.
But the axe swings right to left in a pretty wide and even arc. And I picked up the sword in one of the games, and it starts left and swings right so that it's facing forward, right?
Right.
But that changed my entire way of playing, because I'm so used to sort of walking up to enemies sort of tilted, with the right facing towards the enemy, right?
Right, exactly.
Exactly what I'm doing
the
right
sword,
now.
I can't do that. I have to go in left facing.
Exactly.
Which is interesting for a couple reasons, right? But it also I didn't like it because I wasn't used to it,
Right.
And so a sort of interesting element out of that became that the sword was actually almost an obstacle when it would drop.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to use a weapon that I wasn't good with yet,
Right.
And that was a really interesting moment.
Absolutely.
Because I think ideally, right, you'd be comfortable or familiar with all weapons, but I'm pretty sure that any player would sort of start to favor one or two.
Exactly.
Right?
We want them to. we don't penalize you for not picking up weapons. It's perfectly fine just to leave them on the ground. We do want you to pick up weapons and to adapt. I think one of my mantras was the best player in this game will know how to play every weapon. Like they'll just know how to adapt to every weapon.
But it's so cool that they feel so different.
Yeah, that's to kind of like hit on a point you made earlier. They don't feel different in a fundamental way. Like they don't do anything that any of the other weapons technically don't do. They just they operate in a way that is more or less analog to the other weapons, just stretched in a particular degree that makes them personalized to their particular thing. Like one might swing more times, or one might have a bigger arc. But they all have arcs and they all swing. It's just one just does it better than another. That's all. Like I think the only one that might do that a little bit differently is they all have the same damage values, but the hammer slightly does more damage to emphasize it's slower, but it will kill things a little faster per one single hit. So you need to hit.
I didn't know that.
Exactly. It's not.
All right, so the hammer is now the new weapon.
It's now a potential non-crap weapon.
It is actually the weapon people most often say. Like when we've had beta testers play this game, people will just say like, "Hammer sucks. Why would you ever use it?"
Yeah,
but later on, it actually does end up having a use.
And it's for the reason that we want people to sort of explore the weapons on their own.
Something sort of interesting that's sort of occurring to me, kind of as you're talking about the sort of nuances with the different weapons, is sort of the same thing that I think about whenever I sort of play like sequels to like not exactly fighting games, but I don't know, sequels to like hack and slashes, right?
Okay.
Like there's sort of a point I think where like a lot of sequels will get some criticism, right? Because they like they don't change enough, right? Or they don't like progress the design or whatever enough, right?
Yeah.
But that's often like from the outside, right? Whenever you're like into that game and like into that game's mechanics, and then you get a sequel, right? Like the interesting things aren't like those big changes aesthetically, right? They're sort of all the little tweaks that are made to the combat system. Like you think about going from like Smash like 2 to Smash 3, or I don't know, I'm not a Smash player, but like
for sure.
you sort of get my point, right?
Yeah,
so like I'm sure like fighting game players feel this a lot with like Mortal Kombat and that sort of stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And so what's interesting to me is that the weapons, they sort of feel like that, right? Like they're not like these like groundbreaking changes, but they are these sort of like small like nuanced tweaks to an existing system. And like learning each one is sort of like rediscovering that system from a slightly different angle. And I think it's a really cool thing. You sort of captured that cool like sequel feeling whenever you know the combat and like you know the system. You sort of captured that, but with like each weapon iteration, and that's just really neat to me. I thought that was a really cool thing.
Thanks.
As I was playing it.
Yeah, it was very deliberate for us to make sure that when a person picks up a weapon, even if they've never picked up that weapon before, if they swing it once, they probably know instantly how they should probably be using it. It was important for us because you just don't have so much time to explore the weapon, the combat itself. Like, you need to be able to feel safe to just swing the weapon. They all, like, for example, as you get a weapon experience and they all evolved into like level 1, level 2, level 3 tiers of their weapons, those also need to be like just almost completely. There are some times where this is not exactly the case, but they need to be net positive in every aspect. It needs to have a broader arc. It needs to be faster if that is better for that weapon or the point of that weapon. Not to be clear, that's not always better in every weapon's case, because sometimes you want a slow swing to cover more area, to have more weapon coverage, because sometimes you just want, like, when a weapon is big and it swings large in a large arc, it just generally, like, if you could stick your weapon out there and just sort of wiggle it around and destroy guys by hitting it, that would technically be the best strategy, right? You could just get on there and just move around. So technically, just because something is faster doesn't mean it's better. That's why it is very deliberate that some of the weapons need to be slower and some of them need to be faster. They have different purposes. You just have to play them differently.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure that when you pick up a new weapon, it feels good, it's easily understandable, that you feel okay to swing it around a few times and kind of understand it. I mean, we take advantage of the fact that we don't have like a bunch of different mechanics that modify the way that your weapon works. Like say for example, we don't have a dash attack because we don't have a dash. Like we don't have any types of other mechanics that would change your fundamental approach to combat. We just move around and attack. This might change if, say for example, we have a different game or a sequel to this game or something like that, where
or just this one makes a bunch of money and then you'll put out that DLC,
do something else. I know. Yeah, we suddenly make this into like a legit hack and slash that has a story where you save a princess. All that. I do want skins. I do want skins very badly. Oh yeah, that would be honestly. There's so many cosmetic things that would be awesome. But yeah, I mean, in general, we wanted to make sure that this was quick, pick up and play, fast to understand, but then also, like, I didn't want to sacrifice the kind of depth that I liked in games just because here's the thing, I have lots of things I want to put in games, but I shouldn't impose on other people just because I like them. Like, that doesn't mean that like my idea of what I like in games is the best because I'm making a game and now everybody can STFU because I'm making my game whatever. Like it's not, my interests are not paramount to what this game's the thing in this game should have in it. Not the least of which is because the game's team involves multiple people that aren't me. Like that, it should also involve their interests, right? They should also get a say in like, oh, this weapon doesn't feel good, or like this weapon sucks. It's like, okay, as from a design perspective, how do we approach this to make sure that those people are being met here? Like that, we need to make sure that it's important to be able to make sure that they're having fun too. And if they're not understanding the mechanics of the game, how do we teach them? How do we make sure that they're acclimating to this thing? Because I feel convinced once they're able to do the cool thing, it will feel good for them to do. Like it's. Like going back to the original question you had about like what inspires this game, one of my favorite games of all time, Rhythm Heaven or Rhythm Tengoku, because that game teaches you in little short segments in the very beginning of each mini game how to play itself for that mini game specifically, and then throughout the rest of it, it's just kind of messing with you, but it never changes too much. It doesn't, throughout each little mini game, it doesn't do anything drastically different. It just sort of messes with your head. They might say, for example, if you're always often throughout the mini game waiting for a visual cue to know when to press a button or something like that, they might occlude that for a second and then kind of screw with you. But the rhythm remains the same. Like it's still, you're still pressing buttons to the rhythm. So without getting too much into the weeds about like what Rhythm Tengoku or Rhythm Heaven is, or anything like that, basically the whole idea is that I wanted to emulate the idea that you could give somebody, like, I guess the way that I would describe what I enjoyed anyways about Rhythm Heaven is imagine for a minute you're in a nightclub or a bar and they say, sorry guys, the live show is not going to be playing, our bassist or our guitarist is out, we're not going to be able to have it. And everyone's just like, oh dang it, like this, no live band. And then you think like,
Can I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is a wild example, and I have no idea where it's going, but I'm very interested to know where this is going. Please continue.
So they say that, and you think, well, I know guitar a little bit, and so you'd think everybody here should deserve like a cool. I wanted a cool live thing, but let's just see if I can do something here about this. So you go up to the stage, you pick up the guitar, and then you pluck a few strings, you play a little bit, and then you realize you actually are awesome at it. You didn't realize you were. It's like, oh dude, this is awesome. Yeah, you're just like this. Whoa, like somebody, like maybe part of the band was like, okay, we play on twos, we do this, like we usually have this kind of rhythm, and you're like, he calls out a few songs that you're like, okay, I get that, I know that, and then he's just like, okay, let's do sort of like quick, like little test kind of thing, and then you just rock it, and you're like, dude, this is awesome. This feels good, not just to hear, but to play. Like to play the instrument, to be awesome at it feels great. Like it feels great to perform.
So kind of on that note, actually, one of the things that I was also really impressed by is just like you're talking about, right? The sort of like game feel. Like even if I'm like just god awful at this game, right? Like it feels good to play. Like just plain and simple, right? And like there's a lot of things that I see that y'all are doing to sort of like juice that, right? And so like for I guess anybody that's watching that like isn't like familiar with like game dev terms, right? Like juicing like anything, right? Is sort of like, how do you take like something that's like, all right, you swing a sword, which could be really boring, right? Like and like I guess the guides of damage, right? Like what are all the things that you do in the game to like make that simple thing that could be whatever into holy shit, this feels amazing,
Right. Yeah.
And so like with this game, right, like I'm seeing like y'all are doing hit stops where like every time you hit an enemy, it's like the time like slows down just like a tiny bit before it picks up. All of the flashes and the explosions and particles and stuff, right? But like this is the thing that I'm not particularly great at with game design. So I'm actually really curious, like how did y'all approach the sort of like the juicing of the game feel, and how did y'all like get it this juicy?
Ed and I had the benefit of working together on a few projects prior to this, and I set aside some of the priorities to me as the primary visual person on the team. And so when I was sort of talking about what were my priorities, I know on the slow motion explosion, it's like
it just keeps going.
I threw my weapon at the end of it, so during the time slow when I was dying, it got set off.
Amazing. Holy shit. All right,
I know you should do some replays in more slow motion, Ed, I think.
Oh yeah.
So in some of our previous projects, I had the luxury of being able to talk about some of my priorities in terms of what I think makes for a good special effect or makes for a good impact for something. And it's just something that I had been sort of visually aware of as I was playing games, because whether or not this is fun for other people is kind of irrelevant for me personally, but the reality is that I play games very academically. Whenever I'm playing a game, almost always I'm just like paying attention to what are they doing, why did this work, why do I feel like this is more fun than another thing. Like that almost never turns off in my brain. Like that's just, from a design perspective, I'm almost always analyzing what I think works and what doesn't. Obviously, I'm still
slow motion.
Yeah, so you can play replays back in slow motion. You can kind of modify the speed at which they play back.
Very cool.
To 0.1 to 0.5, I think it used to. Did it used to be slower than this, or was it only the faster option?
You used to be able to go up to 10x until I found out that screwed up the score count
for the replay. Yeah,
at the end. So
maybe going a little too fast.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off.
And no, perfectly fine. I had the opportunity and do have the opportunity oftentimes when I'm playing games to kind of observe what I think works and what doesn't, and I'm often analyzing them from a visual perspective because I'm a visual person. And so when I look at games, they say, for example, the hit pause is something that's really important in fighting games, for example, because fighting games, there are times where there are things that literally link together within a frame. So like we're talking about 60th of a second here. That's very fast of a time for a person to be able to react to. And so if you don't have hit pause in games like that, you almost cannot ask. It's almost inhuman to ask some of the things that the games would be asking of you. But because hit pause happens, and because it happens at particular times, it allows people to understand, one, not only the impact of what happened, but it gives them actual physical time to respond to things that they're able to the game is asking them to do. Like it's... Yeah. I like high dexterous games, but I also don't want to give people carpal tunnel. Like I totally understand that. Like there are.
So really, this is for your own health.
Yeah. So there are certain things that I'm like, I don't want the game to be that fast because it's actually somewhat inhumanly possible. It's humanly impossible to respond to certain things that are happening on the screen, especially as a situation like that might happen. And if you don't choose to throw the weapon, I still want you to be able to answer with your own skill, and that. Like if you kind of like feather the trigger to attack in a case like that, you're gonna just get, and some people do get tired if they don't know the rhythm of how to like swing constantly, so they'll just hit it way faster than you need to. You get tired, trigger finger. So we wanted to make sure, like, okay, and Ed has talked about this before, the hit pause in some cases actually ends up being a way to kind of give you an out. Like, it's
like right now you can see while he's swinging his axe, like time is kind of slowing down enough that you can be like, okay, here's where guys are coming from, there's a bullet here, I need to move this direction, and then you hit it again, and then you're like, okay, now I have some more time to think about this.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm talking about too, right? Like, because you're talking about like how over the top it is, and it is.
Right.
But like it's also like the subtlety of like little moments, those little pauses from those hit stops, literally, that let it become, you know, playable within like that just amount of chaos, you know.
Right. Absolutely.
So I'm kind of curious, right? Like again, this is just like my own like morbid curiosity, partly because I'm not good at recreating this sort of stuff.
I don't know if I would agree with that. I think
I appreciate it. but I'm sort of curious, can you like literally walk through like what are all of the layers of stuff that y'all added to go from, you know, I swung this sword at an enemy to like I swung the sword at the enemy and like it feels amazing. Does that make sense? Like what are all of the things that I wouldn't just notice? Sure. Without like literally seeing all those layers, right?
Yeah, for sure. So let's unpackage some of the effects that are going around here. So whenever you swing your weapon, there's a trail effect to help indicate where your weapon has been and where it's going, and that's to indicate for you as a player, like if you swing it once, this just gives you a broad idea of like this is your coverage area. This this just lets you know, and it informs you like this is its effective area. So you only need to want to do that.
Because like honestly, I don't think I actually like noticed that before.
Most people don't consciously process it, I think.
Yeah. Right, but like this is what I mean, right? Like there's a ton of like craftsmanship, and like that's really what I'm talking about, right? Is like, craftsmanship. Like there's a ton of craftsmanship that goes on to make it like work and like actually feel that good, and it's not obvious. And I'm genuinely really interested. So please continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of games do, but in this case, we're trying to use it informatively. We're trying to make sure that people know kind of like where the effective area is. So that's one thing that happens before you even do the impact of the blast. Or just, like hit a guy. When you hit a guy, we want to make sure that how much impact that weapon had is obvious to the enemy. So there's a few different particle effects that are happening. There is one that happens that is an outward explosion. It's just outward of, it's radial to the whatever you hit, and that's a very subtle one, but there's one that streaks outwards in the direction away from you towards the enemy, and that happens to indicate what direction they were away from you. And that's
so the radial one from the enemy is the same color as the enemy, right? It's almost like it's bits are kind of flying off.
Well, that's the explosion one.
Yeah, so the radial one, if you just see an enemy die, you'll notice there is a small ring that kind of expands outward from them.
Right.
It is white in color and is transparent near the middle, and is less transparent on the outer edges.
Right, and that mostly just indicates the area of that explosion's effect, or where it just blew away. Well, it's sort of to if you're talking about the halo, I call the halo.
Yes,
ring.
That's right.
I see it. Yeah.
I think that's the radio one you're talking about.
Yeah. So that one is just to indicate that something died. So outside of I guess I'll get into the ones that are dying in a second here, but when you just hit an enemy, there is a small effect that happens when you just hit them, and there's a there's a directional one that indicates the direction you hit the enemy, and that's
you're right. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. So that's the dots one when you hit them. Yeah.
So what's the reason why that is important? Most specifically, the reason why the directional was important is to help the player understand like what direction the enemy is in relationship to you. So that's just kind of like indicate this is where they were in relationship to you, this is where you hit them, so you can kind of calibrate yourself each hit. Like, oh, they were here, this is how the hit came in, okay, I can kind of like orient myself depending upon where these other enemies are and where they are in relationship to that enemy. It just helps you to kind of like directionally orient yourself around it.
Yeah, but it's extremely functional.
Yeah, it totally is, because we kind of need to be able to make sure, like when it's visually cool, because when you're spinning around like this, there's a bunch of streaks just kind of like streaking outwards away from you to kind of indicate you're pushing away, but also to indicate like there is force away. This is, for example, for any enemy that doesn't die in one hit, you'll push them away in that direction, and that particle effect that is directional away from you towards the enemy helps to indicate what direction they are going to be flying in. So it's not always like the biggest indicator, but it is an indicator that this is the direction that they're going to be getting hit in. So like that, for example, that kind of like cone of effects that's happening there. Yeah. When an enemy dies, there's a few particle effects that indicate what kind of explosion it was. So first, there's a radial explosion from this. They're just small dots. There are things that we call a capsule, and those capsules are those pink sort of pill-shaped things that happen exploding away from them. And that's
so
in
they
the
sort
direction.
of like burst out, and then they sort of delay and then
Explode
stop. It's
out
like they
and
lay
then-
on the ground.
Exactly, yeah.
I see.
It's supposed to look like they're broken parts, the broken part of that enemy. And that's to indicate, one, that it died, and two, the color of it to indicate that that was what you destroyed. So if you're destroying a bunch of darts, these green guys, you'll see a lot of green there. So if you destroy these bruisers, those pink ones, those pink things will disappear. And that's to indicate if you're having a bunch of things explode on the screen, you need to know which things you destroyed, because some things won't always, like you might hit some things and not destroy others. So you kind of want to know, did I see a flourish of blue? Because if I didn't, then that blue thing is not dead. Like that's to indicate to you like what is and isn't alive. So and
When
I
there's
also
so many like on top of each other.
Yes, exactly. When they're sort of overlapping, we want to make sure that people know visually, make a visual distinction. And then there's also when your weapon breaks. So when your weapon breaks, there's a few effects obviously over there. So obviously in on top of the enemy's destructive particles, when they just blow up, all those things I just described, we also overlay what would you call it? The heat blur effect?
That's what I initially had envisioned as this kind of distortion ring that expands outward from the explosion.
Right. We pair that with sort of like smoky, wispy thing that kind of like pushes things away. It's an effect that happens right afterwards. So both of those things are on the exact ring of where the effect area is. So first of all, the heat explosion ring is on the exact size of the effective area of the explosion. So that thing expands and then just disappears. That's where the effective area of everything inside that field being killed is going to be. And then the sort of wispy kind of like pushing smoky particle away kind of thing is there to indicate that enemies like around this area are going to be pushed away now. Instead of destroyed, they're just going to be sort of pushed away. So those two particles help to indicate to the player very subtly, like this is your effective area when you explode. Now if you internalize these, like this is the effective area for a level 2 explosion, you will know how close enemies need to be when you trigger your explosion. So that sort of helps you understand, like this is where you need to position yourself if you want to catch these enemies in the destructive area.
Wow.
So I think in general those are probably, if I recall, more or less all the explosions. I think all of the particles and effects that are layered on top of each other. There's a few that are replicated for the player. That's slightly different, but would you say is that it, Ed, or is there anything else that you remember?
There were a couple of other visual things and to be clear, this is all you, not me. That we also do. There's a little bit of like a screen wide like lines effect that we do.
Oh yeah.
I'm almost going to refer this. It's like an anime. Yeah.
The animes do. That's more just to give intensity to the explosion.
Yeah, and then I think there's like maybe one or two other things that are purely visual, but that is, I think, almost all of it.
For hitting enemies anyways, I think there's probably one other thing in terms of the player getting hit that I'll highlight, and this is just because I kind of liked it. We went to, sure, go ahead. So when you get hit, you break apart. So that's you break apart into little particles, and each of those are actually an individual like piece that I created that actually broke apart from the character itself. Not hard work. It's fortunate that our character is just an arrow, because if it were not that, we'd have to go into a little bit more work to break apart the player themselves breaking, and that we just apply a small velocity and spin to the player particle as they get broken, and that was just because whenever you got hit, it was a little bit, we had actually a lot of work, and I'm still from time to time we still get some people who are a little bit confused about this, but I think we're in a fairly good area. When you explode, sometimes looks a little bit similar to when you get hurt, and we wanted to make sure that people understood clearly. If you could get hurt again, just to kind of indicate this.
Oh yeah.
We
like
will
this
indicate.
You're breaking apart.
This is when you get hurt. And you'll notice two things happen here. Not only do you break apart, but the screen dims and it only highlights you and the enemy or the thing that hit you. So that's to clearly indicate that like these are the perpetrators. These are the most important things right now. You got hit and this is what hit you. So you understand and have feedback like what should you have been careful of at that time? Like you should have been careful of this bullet, or you should, because I mean there's so many things happening at once, right? When there's so many enemies on screen, you can easily get lost in a lot of what's happening. So we want to make sure like that it's not confusing, so that you again can calibrate yourself when a hit happens. What was it? You kind of want to know. This is effectively our Call of Duty way of showing you the kill cam. Like this is like, hey, just to let you know, so you can learn from this. You keep getting hit by bullets. Like you're not watching where the bullets are.
I mean, it is a learning moment.
Right, exactly. But we don't want to shove it in your face. Like it's just one of those things where it's like, in fact, if anything, we're not just like pointing to you like, here's this thing. It's just like it's dimming everything else. That's all we're doing. We're just dimming the rest of the screen, and by effect highlighting what hit you so that you know instantly like, okay, first of all, this looks visually different than an explosion because there's only two things highlighted on the screen. It's not some big white blur of things like an explosion is. It's just you and this enemy, so you know you got hit. And then second of all, what hit you. So again, just repeating the same thing that you know and can learn, like, why do I keep seeing a dart whenever I get killed? Or why do I keep seeing a bullet? I'm just not watching out for these bullets.
Or even
things like
just
that.
to sort of understand, like, what's the, like, I don't know, collision radius between, like, around my player versus, like, around a bullet, for example, right? Like, what is too close, right? And you sort of get to know that very clearly when you get killed by one, because you zoom in, you pause, and you can see it. Like, it gives you that moment to really, like, take in what happened, you know?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's one of those learning moments that we want people to be able to have with the game is calibrating themselves. And we do, again, like you pointed out, we slow down the moment so that you can kind of take it in and understand from a human perspective. Not only did you just get hit, but like here's a little bit, a brief moment to kind of help you understand why, how, and what had happened.
Yeah. It's also like a nice like textural thing too when I think about playing multiple rounds. Because it gives you that second to breathe, that second to pause before you hit restart, you know?
Right.
It gives you a second to sort of digest what happened.
Exactly.
But like
if you got hit, you're just like, oof, okay, all right, time to get into the zone.
Exactly. It gives you a second, you know?
Yeah.
And I think more broadly too, I just want to kind of zoom back out, because like the original question that I asked you was sort of like, what are just all of the layers that go into like making like just any hit feel awesome, right? Yeah, and I think what's actually come out of that is like not only are there like so many layers, like if I think like, because I was actually taking notes, right? So like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Like I count like 9 or 10 like different distinct, maybe 11 even, distinct effects that are all kind of layered on top of like just like a like hit where an enemy dies, right?
Yeah.
But I think the thing that actually came through when you were kind of discussing that was also the sort of intentionality and the sort of restraint that y'all are having on those, right? It's not just like stacking like a bunch of things to make it look cooler, right?
Right.
Like it's stacking a bunch of things to make it look cooler with an eye for, you know, what the player can see. Like what does each effect like do for the player and their ability to understand what happened? And like that's like really impressive to me, right? Because I think like there's good game feel. And then there's like good game. Well, I guess this is really what separates like good game feel from like just like excessive like effects, right?
Right, yeah. How purposeful whatever you're laying on is.
Yeah. And it really just kind of strikes me that like, yeah, pretty much each layer that you had that you were describing like had a like specific intent behind it. And like it
Yeah.
needed to be balanced, you know, so that
Right.
the player could still see what's happening, right? Or that
Right.
you know was something there to look cool, but also to give the player a moment to observe things, or a teaching tool in some capacity.
Because there were definitely times where there was some over-the-top stuff.
Yeah.
Like people got
Oh,
there was
sure.
earlier on. There was definitely times where we're like, okay, we're laying on too many effects. Like it's confusing to the player what's happening, and then we just had to calibrate based on that. We just had to change and modify some of the things.
But there's a ton of craftsmanship in that, and I just got to say, I really respect it. I really am impressed with what y'all are
thank
doing
you.
here. It feels awesome to play. It really does.
Thank you. Yeah.
Of course.
There's again I always find that to be funny, but from one artist to another, that's very appreciated. It's always good to hear
course.
like your craftsmanship being appreciated. Not that I'm looking to be like praised or anything like that. It's always mostly actually good to hear like that there was a reason that is being recognized for my reasons for putting them into the game, because that's what's most important to me. It's not that it just looks good. I like that, but that it was recognized for the reason why I put it in there, and that like me being able to explain it, and that those reasons being able to be understood is kind of nice.
Yeah. Well, and then just from like an observer perspective, and I mean, again, it's kind of basic, right? But like, yeah, even just like being able to like actually notice and like take in like, oh yeah, there is a trail behind the weapon. I understand why that's there now as well. And like that, again, that's really useful. I can actually use that to improve my own ability to play the thing, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Because now I know to like, all right, let's track the trail of the weapon, and that gives me a pretty good idea for like what the arc of that thing is.
Right. Yeah.
And so like, okay, now I have a good metric to like really quickly gauge like what my arc is, and so I can sort of adjust my gameplay if I'm not used to a weapon.
Right.
And that's just not a way of thinking of playing that I would have done before, you know?
Yeah, unless it was like explained to you in the way that I explained it.
Right,
Or
yeah.
if somebody had explained it. Yeah. For sure. Well, as we're approaching 15 past the hour since we started a little bit late, we really appreciate you coming on here, Steve. It's been really fun, and those are some really great questions. I really appreciate you being able to ask that stuff. It's actually nice. It's from not only from a design perspective, from a visual artist perspective, being able to look into and deep dive into some of the stuff that makes the game tick.
But
It's
also
really
just from my
big-
ego.
I mean, that doesn't hurt, right?
It's like somebody's paying attention to what we're doing. It feels nice.
I think people should pay attention though. I think again, like it's like genuinely, I'm having a really good time playing it, and
Thank you.
it's also again like a thing that I'm like, as a person who makes games and who does graphics and things, right? It's also an area that I struggle with, just personally. Some of like the really juicy like hit feels they all have. That game feel is really, I think, something special.
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Of course.
Yeah. And I think that's more or less going to close out our hour here. Is there, I guess before we do that, is there anything you'd like to plug, Steve?
Ooh, gosh, is there?
Feel free, anything and anything.
Okay, yeah. So if y'all want, I guess, if anybody watches this, y'all can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Zap for that. That's ZAPE.
It's on the screen.
That.
Bottom right of the screen.
Oh, is it? Cool.
Yep.
I appreciate it. Yeah, follow me there if y'all want to see like my art and stuff. I also get fairly political, so like heads up.
Just know we are in support of the same things you are supporting. So
Hear ya. And then beyond that, you actually brought it up earlier. There was a project that I did with a couple friends to help another friend launch her album.
Yes.
And yeah, like if people want to check that out, that'd be super awesome too. So the artist name is Karen Connolly, and she's been doing just all kinds of really exceptionally good, sort of nerdy, clever, and genuinely good, like feel good music.
Yeah.
So we did a little visual project. Actually, I worked with the audio designer, technical audio artist. I'm not sure what
audio engineer.
anyway,
You have to ask him.
who did audio and audio effects for Breakpoint.
That's right.
So we worked together on this project with another friend of ours, and basically made a little real-time album art that reacted to the sound of one of the songs on her album.
Pretty slick.
So please check that out. Check out her work. She's doing some really awesome stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
That's all I got.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everybody for this entire week. We're very thankful for being able to not only showcase this to everybody, but for just the opportunity to be a part of the Steam Summer Game Festival, or Summer Steam Game. I'm not sure where summer fits into that Steam Game Festival part. Steam Game Festival Summer Edition, I guess. For being a part of that, and then also just being able to see all of your guys's your leaderboard entries onto the board and all of your comments. It's been awesome to be able to have the response as it is. Please tell everybody if you like the game, please tell anybody about it. But regardless, thank you all for joining us this week. That will be us closing out. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
See you.